Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have an anatomy lesson to share with you today. We're using this book by Charles Kovacs for our Waldorf Anatomy main lesson block, and today we're working on digestion and teeth and saliva for this lesson. I'm also using another book as illustration inspiration because we're going to be drawing this side profile of the mouth and the throat using this book, the anatomy book by Welcome to the Museum series. So this is a quite complicated illustration to do, but I have a little trick on how we're going to be able to do this. We're using our Waldorf main lesson books. You can find these at A Child's Dream, and they measure 9.5 inches by 12 inches, and they have blank pages on both sides of the page. However, there is an onion skin that separates the page, and we're going to be using that onion skin in order to trace the illustration. So I've got my Lyra color pencils, and I'm also going to be using a pencil, of course, in order to trace, and I'm using the pencil also to do some low lights and to accentuate different aspects of this illustration. This is a really complicated illustration, and as much as I'm trying to trace the design, trace the illustration, it is quite complicated. There are a lot of details, and I'm going to get just a rough design, and then I'm going to go back in and add some more details. But even just with this rough design and illustrating just through tracing, we actually get a really good side profile. I wanted to make sure that we got the teeth, the tongue, and the throat because that's going to be part of the lesson that we have already presented and discussed, and we will be adding our narration to both sides of this illustration. Now that the basic tracing is complete, I'm choosing a number of colors that are going to coordinate with the illustration in this book. I have a couple of anatomy books, and each one has a different tone to their illustrations, and these ones have a bit more of a muted color palette with a bit more gray tone, so I'm going to try to mimic that with the color pencils that I have. Once this illustration is complete, my daughter will copy the illustration that I've done, or she will trace her own illustration. I would rather that she did one that had less detail because we're trying to keep this main lesson block with the senses. We're trying to keep the lessons that we're learning and the illustrations that we're doing something that is within our sense perception rather than something that we can't sense, can't see, or can't feel. So when it comes to the mouth and the throat, another option would be to do a self-portrait of your own mouth, slightly open so you can see your teeth and your tongue, and I feel like that would be a little bit more connecting for the student to really observe their own teeth and their own tongue and really understand how chewing happens, how your saliva is released, how swallowing occurs, and then we can further speak about the epiglottis and the trachea, the windpipe, versus the esophagus and how your food goes down into your stomach. So this side profile is quite abstract since it's not something that we can really see. We can definitely feel our throat, and we can feel when food or water has gone down the wrong way and then we need to cough. But having an illustration like this is a little bit more abstract than what I would have liked to do. And so following this lesson, doing a self-portrait of your mouth and your teeth, I think is going to really bring home some of these concepts that we've learned in these two lessons. Now, sometimes with these lessons, I am collecting several days worth of work to just do one illustration, and this serves us really well since an illustration like this takes up almost the entire main lesson block time. Our main lessons run about 2 hours with a bit of time for our opening activities, time for review. Then the majority of the time is spent on lesson book work, which would include an illustration like this, as well as all of our written work. And then at the end of that lesson, we do the new lesson learning, which is usually something that's a little bit more passive after we've done so much active work for the lesson. So we end our day with the new lesson, which is reading aloud from the book by Charles Kovacs called Muscles and Bones, or I will pre-read the lesson in advance, and then I will present that information to my daughter, which usually yields more discussion and more conversation and more authentic examples, since when you are retelling it, usually some of those other ideas start to come in, especially if you have a chance to read the chapter at least a day ahead of time. then you yourself as a teacher can really process that information and come to the lesson with your own examples and your own experiences. So a lesson like this with an illustration like this could happen over the course of 2 days, since this was approximately an hour to do the illustration with some of the written content. Instead of working on a chalkboard, I have opted to work in a main lesson book, and that way my daughter can refer back to these lessons even if we have progressed and she hasn't gotten a chance to do the illustration, versus erasing it from the chalkboard and not having that illustration, or being stuck on a lesson without the ability to move forward to other lessons because some of the lesson work isn't complete. Something else about having the main lesson book for me as the teacher is that I can write my notes and my narration into a main lesson book, which means that I have these notes the next time I teach these lessons, or I have these notes to prepare to deliver the lesson if I'm doing it in advance of the lesson, or I have the notes so that my daughter or my students can refer back to those notes if they forgot some aspects of the lesson, or they can use it for dictation or copy work. So I really like having all of this work in a main lesson book so I can preserve the illustrations as well as the written work. If you're following a Waldorf curriculum, you'll notice that anatomy comes up twice in middle school. This is the first anatomy main lesson block that I'm doing with my daughter, and this is the introduction to anatomy, which includes physiology and nutrition and hygiene. We'll get into more in-depth anatomy lessons in the next main lesson block the following year. So a lot of our lessons right now have to do with nutrition and hygiene and care of the body. And I really like that approach before we get into the more scientific aspects of the muscles, the bones, the interior of the body, the different systems within the body, the cardiovascular system, the nervous system. Those are all anatomy lessons that are going to follow this main lesson block in about a year. This main lesson block has to do a lot more with the care of our body, and I really love keeping it according to the senses. So what we see, what we eat, how we eat, when we sleep, those are the topics that we're basically covering for this portion of our main lesson block. So I've written the narration next to this illustration. There is one more narration that's going to cover digestion and the stomach, but this narration has to do with the mouth, the teeth, and the saliva. And a lot of the information for this narration comes from two resources: the Charles Kovacs book called Muscles and Bones, as well as the anatomy book by Welcome to the Museum series. You can find a complete list of all of the resources we're using for our Waldorf anatomy main lesson block, as well as our anatomy unit study, on the blog post that accompanies this video, and you can find that link in the description box below. So here's a quick look at the final lesson with our narration and our illustration. I really love the way the illustration turned out. I was a little bit apprehensive about how it would turn out, but being able to trace it with that onion skin paper has been such a gift for this main lesson block. I'm really glad that we kept those onion skins in rather than tearing them out once we're done with our lesson. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our Waldorf main lesson block for anatomy. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can find all of the tutorials and the lessons for this main lesson block, as well as all of the links to the resources for the materials that we're using. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.